My name is Chaplain Matt Hamrick, and I am the Family Life Program. I've chosen the symbolic experiential approach to family therapy, and this approach was started by Carl Whitaker back in the 1940s. He was practicing psychiatry, and he realized that his approach wasn't working. He realized that many people's problems come from dysfunctional interactions, so he used varied approaches to help these people. This therapy is also known as the therapy of the absurd because Whitaker had a gregarious personality, and he used many different kind of techniques that were off the wall and nonconformist and in his approach to family therapy. The main aspects of this are the importance of the personality of the therapist and the personhood of the therapist. So it's very important for the therapist that uses this technique to be outgoing and be willing to take risks, and also to have a very important personhood, because it requires the therapist to share a lot of their own story. So it requires a lot of personal disclosure. And so this therapy is not for everyone, but it's a very interesting, and it provides a lot of different techniques and tools to be used in marriage and family therapy. This approach may be the most unique of any of the approaches to family therapy. It requires the therapist to deliberately offset the equilibrium, the emotional equilibrium of the client. When the client comes in, many times they're expecting to just talk their way through their problems. And this approach gets them kind of out of their head, and it gets them kind of into their heart, into their feelings and their emotions. And because of the unorthodox approaches and techniques that this approach uses, it makes it a lot different than a lot of the other techniques that just require a therapist to sit and talk with a client. This approach requires a sensitive and charismatic therapist. So again, it's the personality of the therapist that makes this approach different. It's not a cookie cutter type approach where any therapist can walk in and use this. It's who they are. And so if a therapist has that type of personality and the ability to conform to this, then it works. But if it doesn't, then it makes it quite difficult for a therapist to use this. And then the third that makes it different is the reliance on the personhood of the therapist. Now, every approach requires therapists to be in touch with themselves and to deal with their own issues, but this approach, because of the amount of self-disclosure, it requires the therapist to have a true personhood, to know who they are, to know why they're sharing what they're sharing, and to have a reason behind it. Many times self-disclosure can become about the therapist, but in this approach, the therapist knows exactly what he or she is doing, and they use these self-disclosure to bring about change in the client for that reason. So I was drawn to this originally by the techniques. I saw a video that displayed some of the techniques that really stood out to me, and I saw how they can really be used to be very effective in the counseling situation, and I was intrigued by that. I'm also interested in the unorthodox nature, so it doesn't conform to a box. It doesn't fit inside a paradigm really that's already existing. So that's intriguing. And again, the person of the therapist, I brought this up, but it's really important to me, I think, because this one, the therapist especially, has to be grounded in who they are as a person and as a therapist, and just a requirement. I think it's a forcing function for the therapist to know what they're doing, why they're doing it, and who they are in this situation. Sure, that's a great question. There are many techniques within this approach, and some of them that I really like is the way that Whitaker used drawings. So especially with children, because children often have a difficult time expressing their emotions or what they're feeling through words. They just don't have the vocabulary to really say what's going on within them. And so they use drawings. And so a therapist would just sit down with a child and just have them draw a picture. And the drawing can really say a lot about what the child is feeling on the inside. Another one that's employed is the circle method, where a therapist will draw a circle on a piece of paper and give it a piece of paper to each family member, and they will draw small circles on the paper to represent themselves and each family member, and then the therapist will compile them and look at the drawings and just make observations. Like, well, you drew yourself here and your husband way over here, or your children are touching you in the picture, and non-judgmental statements, but just observations, and let the client really determine what that means and what the significance of that. Another one is the draw a dream. So the client will have a picture, and there will be a bubble over their head as they're sleeping for children, and the therapist will just say, draw a dream, draw a bad dream. And through this, the therapist can understand what the children are afraid of, what's going through their minds. And so this can really reframe for a parent. It turns from a bad behavior in a child to a fear. And so it translates it into emotion and helps the therapist relate to the parents about what the child is experiencing. And then another method that Whitaker used is co-therapy, the importance of a therapist bringing in another therapist as an expert in the counseling session, so that you can kind of do a good cop, bad cop, where one therapist will really push the client to question themselves and push them for answers, while the other therapist is more nurturing. So that allows a bit of comfort, but also a bit of discomfort in the client as well. A couple more. Sculpting is really helpful, where the therapist has each family member pose their family anywhere they'd like to in the room. Physically get up and move around and have them place their family members in the room, and then discuss, why did you put them there? Why did you have them doing this? It can be very illuminating. You'd always want to start with the children, because the adults can sometimes be a little reluctant to do that, but if the child does it first, then it really opens their parents up to participating. And then finally, I would say the alter ego, where the therapist actually crouches down behind one of the family members, the one most reluctant to speak, and then the therapist speaks for the family member, where they would say things that family member may be reluctant to say, and then the family member just corrects the therapist if they get it wrong. But it allows that family member to actually speak without having to say the words, and it opens up dialogue for the family. That'd be tough, but in one sense I would say that symbolic experiential family therapy can be a powerful approach to use with clients, but it requires patience, practice, and a strong personhood of the therapist. I just think it's very important to not enter this lightly. This is not an approach where you would just show up and do it in a counseling session. You would need much supervision. You would need a lot of practice with this in order to use it effectively.